The wind moved like judgment across the Wyoming plains, dragging dust and snow through the ruins of what once was. Where a barn had stood, sturdy, red, full of hay and laughter, now only blackened ribs of timber reached skyward like the fingers of a dying man. Smoke still clung to the beams, faint and bitter. Cinders scattered over the ground, mixed with wind-blown straw and soot-dusted snow. Beneath the largest beam, half buried in ash, Clara Boone knelt in the birth throes of her child. Her breath came hard, fogging in the cold. Sweat streaked the soot on her brow. Blood darkened her skirts and the wind clawed at her shawl, but she made no sound. There was no one to hear it. The only witness to her labor was the wide, indifferent sky and the half-burned wedding dress she'd strung up on a line before the fire took the barn, now hanging like a ghost among the char. Then, from the horizon, hoofbeats slow and distant, steady as a funeral bell, Clara lifted her head. Through the pale light of mid-morning snow, a rider approached. His coat was worn oilskin, his hat low-brimmed. A long rifle rose over one shoulder, and behind him plodded a mule heavy with packs. His face, when it came into view, was weathered and unreadable, the kind of man the world had scraped down to essentials. He said nothing, just looked once, at the woman kneeling in. Blood and smoke, then dismounted. Clara gripped the blanket beneath her. "I don't need—" The man knelt beside her, wordless. He removed his gloves, revealing hands rough with old scars. He stoked what was left of the fire, added wood from his saddle roll, fetched water from the frozen pump, and cleaned his knife with a linen square. He moved slow, careful, as if used to pain and used to women not wanting him close. She did not ask who he was. He did not offer. The child came before the sun climbed far. A boy, red-faced and strong-lunged. Clara bit down on her sleeve, to keep from screaming. When it was over, she wept without sound. The stranger handed her the child, already swaddled in a corner of his own blanket. He had done this before or seen it done enough to know how. Clara leaned back against the scorched wall, cradling the boy in her arms. "Isaiah," she murmured, her voice raw. "Isaiah Boone," the wind answered for her. The stranger stood then silent as ever and stepped outside. Snow was falling again, light, slow, like ashes with nowhere left to land. He pulled the saddle from his horse, tied the mule to the post, and took up a spot beneath the overhang, just out of the wind. There he sat, sharpening his knife, watching the horizon. Inside the shell of the barn, Clara looked down at her son's face. He was breathing fine, pinked up. She wrapped him tighter, pressed his tiny hand against her cheek. Her eyes burned. The fire crackled low. Her fingers brushed the hem of her ruined dress hanging just above. That final scrap of her wedding day spared from the flames. Now nothing but a faded memory hung on a line for ghosts. She didn't know who the man was or why he had come. Only that he hadn't turned away. Hadn't spoken words he didn't mean. He had helped because he could, then stepped into the snow without asking anything in return. That night, through the door left cracked for warmth, she saw him sitting there in the cold, eyes closed, rifle across his knees, snow in his hair. A stranger come without a word, and yet something in her chest ached less than it had in months. Isaiah slept in her arms, breath slow and soft. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind quieted. Just a little. The days stretched like shadow across the scrubland, long and quiet, framed by wind and wood smoke. Clara moved slow, still sore from the birth, her limbs aching like old fence posts in thaw. She wrapped Isaiah against her chest in a sling stitched. From torn muslin and watched from the porch as the stranger, Jonah, though she didn't yet know his name, drove nails into splintered rails, mended the gate, and split wood with deliberate, unhurried strokes. He worked as though it didn't matter if the fence stood perfect or not, only that it was mended. Like the work itself was a kind of prayer, he spoke rarely. When he did, his voice was low and even, rooted deep in his chest. "Cold front's coming. There's wolf tracks near the bluff. Nothing more. No questions, no stories." He ate what she gave him and slept in the hayloft, wrapped in his own coat. At night, Clara could hear him shifting above the rafters while the snow tapped like ash. on the roof. She wondered what he dreamed. Some nights she dreamed too, but not of the baby, or of Jonah. She dreamed of a girl in a gingham dress, her braid flying loose in the wind, running across a sunlit field before her mother's voice called her back to the hearth. She dreamed of warm hands tugging at her hair, the gentle rhythm of her mother braiding it by firelight while her father smoked his pipe in the corner, humming some hymn long since lost to time. But most nights it was Levi, who came to her, not as the man she married, but as he had been at the end, eyes distant, hands too tight on the reins. He had once been a gentle man, full of dry jokes and callous tenderness, but the war and the debt and the drink had turned something in him hard. The last year he'd spent more time in town than on their land, and when he came back that final time, bloodied, breathless, something hunted in his face, he told her nothing. Only said, "If someone rides up a skin for me, tell him you ain't seeing me." That was the last night the barn stood whole. She kept his tools in the shed still. Axes, files, leather straps he'd oiled with beeswax. She hadn't touched them since the fire. Just couldn't bring herself to. One evening the wind fell still, and the sky took on that blue that only happens just before dark, deep as a bruise, soft as smoke. She looked out the window and saw Jonah sitting with Isaiah in the crook of his arm. The baby didn't cry, didn't fuss, just stared up at him, calm and blinking. Jonah looked back at the child as if reading something in him, something ancient. He rocked slowly, knees drawn up, one hand cupped over Isaiah's back. No sound, no smile, just presence. Clara stood there longer than she meant to. Later that night, as she ladled soup into a tin bowl for him, she asked, "You got a name?" He looked up from the hearth, his eyes catching the light just so, a long pause as though deciding if it mattered. "Jonah," he said at last. She nodded, didn't ask more. The name sat heavy between them, soaked in scripture and storms. She remembered the story, the man who ran from what was asked of him, who found himself in the belly of something too big to understand. Maybe they all lived there now. That night she brushed her hair by the fire the way her mother once had. Her fingers found a knot and worked it loose. She thought of the girl with the wind-blown braid, thought of the years since, what they'd taken. Her reflection in the window was hollowed, lean, but not empty. Outside, Jonah fed the horses. The barn was still half ruined, but he'd cleared a space. He moved slow through the cold, like a man who had nothing left to rush toward and nothing left to outrun. Clara swaddled Isaiah, kissed his brow, and set him gently in the cradle Levi had built. It creaked just a little, the wood seasoned from years in storage. Her gaze drifted to the tool shed out back, the one she hadn't opened since Levi died. Tomorrow, she told herself. Maybe tomorrow. The storm began with a silence so complete it rang in the ears. Then the wind came, low and mean, threading through the chinks in the cabin walls, like it was searching for something to break. Snow thickened in the sky, drifted against the door, blurred the world into a colorless haze. Trees groaned in the gusts, their limbs bending low, burdened with weight and time. Inside, the fire hissed and snapped, its glow casting long shadows that danced on the logs like restless spirits. Clara stoked the flames with careful hands, the baby bundled tight in his cradle. Jonah sat across from her, near the hearth, oiling a whetstone and drawing it slow across the edge of a blade. His rifle leaned against the wall within reach. He didn't look up as she moved, but his eyes flickered when Isaiah cried out once, a soft wail quickly hushed. They shared the space without speech. Her needle moved through wool, an old shawl from her mother's trunk, unraveled and reworked. Hands trembling not from cold, but memory. He watched the knife's edge. She watched the window. Later, when Isaiah finally slept, a new silence settled, not the stillness of snow, but something else. Jonah rose and stepped to the door. He opened it a crack. Wind blew in sharp as a blade, and snow curled at his boots. He knelt, fingers brushing the porch. "Tracks," he said, quiet. She was beside him in a heartbeat. The shape of the print was unmistakable, fresh, heavy, circling wide, a horseman. Could have been a trapper, she said, but didn't believe it. Neither did he. She closed her eyes. "McKinnon," she whispered. The name tasted bitter. a rancher from the next valley, rich with stolen deeds and fast men. Levi had borrowed from him, once, fencing wire and feed, then money, then more. When Levi couldn't pay, McKinnon offered terms no decent man would accept. Levi had refused, but Clara always suspected the fire had come not from accident but from warning. That night they bolted the door and kept the lamps low. Jonah sat, with the rifle across his lap, Clara rocking the baby in silence. The storm worsened. Rafters creaked and snow howled down the chimney like something alive. The cabin felt smaller than it ever had, the kind of closeness that showed you what people truly were. Near midnight the shot came, sharp, close, shattering. The fragile calm, the baby screamed. Clara hit the floor, pulling the cradle with her. Jonah was already at the door, firing back into the dark without hesitation. Another shot rang out, then hoofbeats, fast and ragged, retreating into trees. Then nothing. He stood for a while at the door, guns still smoking, eyes scanning the dark. His breath steamed in the air. When he came back in, he said only, "2 of them. Won't be back tonight." She nodded. Set the baby down again. Watched him sit by the fire, pull out his rifle cleaning kit, and begin the old ritual of powder and cloth and metal. She studied his hands, large, scarred, sure. The kind of hands that had done things a person didn't speak of. But also the kind that had held her son with quiet care. "You running from something?" she asked, finally. He didn't look up. "Not any more?" The fire cracked and a long silence followed. Later they sat together, closer than before, with Isaiah asleep between them. She offered him bread and boiled coffee. He took both, nodding thanks. She noticed how his eyes never fully rested, how they stayed fixed on windows, shadows, movement. Like a dog left too long in the wild, he noticed her hands. Raw-knuckled, reddened by work, nails broken. He reached out once, not touching, just looking. Then looked away again, ashamed of something he hadn't said. The wind had begun to ease, but the world outside was buried in white. Snow to the waist, wolves out in the woods, no doubt. Maybe men worse than wolves. But in the firelight, in the breath between questions, something fragile stirred, not hope, not yet, but a quiet kind of recognition. She'd buried her husband, her peace, her girlhood all in the same cold ground. But now there was someone else here who knew what it was to lose, to carry weight without asking for comfort. They didn't speak again that night. But she didn't flinch when his shadow passed near hers. And when the wind moaned again in the dark, she didn't feel quite so alone. The thaw came slow. First in the sound, drip drip from the eaves, the groan of the earth softening underfoot. Then in the smell, that deep loam scent of waking soil. Snow pulled back like a shroud, revealing bare ground beneath pale grass flattened like memory. The trees budded hesitantly, not trusting the sky but willing to try. The air was still cold, but it no longer bit. Inside the cabin, Isaiah had found his voice. He cooed at the ceiling beams in the mornings, fists curled like promise. His cheeks were full and pink now, his breath even. Clara held him near the hearth, rocking him while the first bluebirds returned to the bare branches outside. She found herself humming again, soft, broken tunes her mother once sang, things she thought she'd forgotten. Jonah stayed. Not like a guest, not quite like family? He rose early, tended to the fence, brought back meat from the ridge. He patched the leak in the roof and split wood without being asked. But still, there was a tension under the roof. Not a sharp one, but taut like the line on a fishing pole, something waiting beneath the surface. She noticed things. The way he turned away when she caught his eye. The way he left carved tokens. A smooth piece of antler for Isaiah to grasp, a feather laid on the windowsill. The stones he placed in quiet patterns around the porch like offerings. At night she would hear him on the porch, humming to the baby while she washed dishes. The melody was unfamiliar, low, rich, not English. It drifted in like mist. She didn't interrupt. One afternoon, with the sun slanting long across the yard, a shape appeared near the woods, cloaked, slow-moving, leaning on a cane carved with symbols. Clara stiffened at first, but then recognition dawned. Old woman Two Fires. She hadn't seen the elder since her own girlhood, when her mother had taken ill and the white doctor had failed. Two Fires had come without being summoned, placed her. Hands on her mother's head, left herbs and warnings. And her mother had lived? Clara had never forgotten. The woman was older now, her hair gone silver and rope-thick, eyes clouded but sharp beneath the haze. She sat beside the hearth without waiting for invitation. The baby went quiet in her arms. She examined him with long, brown fingers, muttering in Lakota, her voice dry as pine needles. Then she unrolled a pouch and gave Clara bundles, for colic, for fevers, for dreaming. Clara thanked her with her eyes. Jonah stood near the door, watching. Two Fires looked up at him once and said something soft in Lakota. He replied without hesitation. Not fluent, but close, familiar. There was a pause. Something passed between them, sorrow or maybe memory. Two Fires gave a small nod, then turned back to Isaiah. After she left, Clara stood on the porch, the herbs still clutched in her hand. You lived with them, she said, not looking at him. I did, Jonah answered. She wanted to ask more, why, how, when, but the words tangled. He was still the same man who had bled into this land beside her, but now he was more. Not just between places, between people. A man, without a single name, shaped by war and fire, belonging to no one. She wondered what else he carried that had no place to go. That night, Jonah came in from the shed with the rifle cleaned and his eyes distant. He set it gently beside the door. I should move on, he said, not in warning, just in offering. Clara said nothing for a long moment. Then, without speaking, she crossed the room and opened the cupboard. From it, she drew a wrapped bundle, stiff with disuse. She laid it on the table and pulled the cloth away. Levi's tools, still sharp, still oiled. Jonah looked at them, then at her. They're yours now, she said. He didn't speak. Just nodded once, the kind of nod that carries weight. The kind of nod you give to a grave or a sunrise. Later, after the baby had been put down and the hearth had burned low, Clara stood brushing her hair. She found herself folding the old wedding dress, not to wear, not to mourn, but simply to put away with care. Like a chapter turned, not torn. Outside, Jonah sat alone, holding one of Levi's chisels, turning it in his hands. He didn't need to say thank you. Some things are spoken best in silence. And somewhere, without either of them saying it, something had begun to grow, not fast, not loud, but steady, like spring. The heat rolled in slow, heavy with wildflowers and storm-split skies. The land bloomed gold and green, buzzing with bees and breath. Isaiah crawled now, fat-legged and curious, chasing shadows across the floorboards. Clara found herself humming. Again, as she swept the porch, as she ground coffee, as she bent to the earth to pull weeds from the garden rows Jonah had helped plant. Then McKinnon came. He rode up in the shimmer of noon, 4 men behind him, all in dust and leather and the smug tilt of power. The kind of men who thought their presence was enough to silence resistance. He didn't bother pretending anymore. Clara met them in the yard, arms folded, boots planted. Her voice was dry and sharp as flint. You've no paper to stand on? She said, Levi's debts died with him. This land was deeded to my grandfather. McKinnon smiled, slow and practiced. Men have taken land for less than debt, Miss Boone, and no court near enough to stop it. Jonah stepped from the barn then, rifle in his hands. He didn't aim. He didn't need to. The weight of him was enough. He stood not in front of her, but just behind, where she could see, and so could they. McKinnon's smile shrank. His eyes moved over Jonah's scars, the quiet stillness that came only from men who'd survived death too many times to count. This ain't over, he said finally, and turned his horse. The hoofbeats faded into the grass. That evening, the light was honey-thick, pouring through the slats in the porch roof. Clara sat by the fire with Isaiah asleep against her chest. Jonah knelt by the hearth, feeding in a pine knot. The smell of sap and smoke filled the air. She cried then. Not loudly, not the kind of weeping that demanded attention, but the soft kind, silent and sharp, like a blade pulled from an Old wound. Jonah didn't move. Just sat with her, letting the silence hold. I'm afraid, she said finally, voice raw. Not of dying, of being left again. Of waking up and finding the world gone cold. I can't, her words faltered. I can't survive another loss. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I never had a home that didn't burn, he sighed. Union took my first, Raiders took my second. Men like McKinnon took the rest. I stopped believing anything could stay. The fire cracked. She looked at him through the glow. Saw the man who had stood between her child and gunfire. The man who'd repaired her roof with hands that once held a different kind of violence. The man who never asked for thanks, only stayed. Slowly, without speaking, she reached up and pulled the pins from her hair. It fell in waves down her back, dark as river mud, glinting red in the firelight. He watched her, not with hunger, but with reverence. He didn't move toward her, just reached out, slow and careful, and took her hand. They sat that way until the flames were low, fingers woven, breath sinking to the rhythm of the wind outside. In the morning, Clara stood at the wash basin, brushing out her hair. Then, slowly, she began to braid it again. Not as armor. Not to hide, but with purpose. She tied it off with a strip of fabric torn from her wedding dress. She dressed in the shawl she'd sewn through winter, the color of dusk and rust. When she stepped out onto the porch, Jonah was sharpening the old hoe with one of Levi's whetstones. She stood in front of him, braid down her back, hand steady. If I ask you to stay, she said, not as help, not as debt, but as a man beside me, will you? He didn't answer. Just looked at her with those dark, weather-worn eyes. Then he nodded once and kept sharpening. She smiled. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. The wind came dry and quick at dawn, carrying the smell of smoke before the light could fully touch the land. Clara woke first. The baby stirred beside her, his tiny fist curled in sleep. Outside, something cracked, a sound too sharp for a branch too heavy for wind. She reached for the rifle. Jonah was already at the door. The flames caught at the edge of the eastern field, curling through dry grass with purpose. It wasn't accidental. Fire set by steady hands. A warning, a summons. From the tree line came hooves. McKinnon again, but no longer posturing. This time his face was tight with rage, not showmanship. He rode in with 2 men, rifles slung, eyes full of the wrong kind of certainty. Clara stepped out, rifle resting in her arms, braid tied back with the same strip from her old wedding dress. She didn't yell. Just stood her ground, her body lined with stillness like steel cooled in snow. Jonah walked beside her, calm, his long coat stirring. In the wind. He carried Levi's rifle. In his eyes, the steadiness of someone who had already decided what he could live with and what he couldn't. You light my land again, Clara said, voice low and sure, and you'll leave a piece of yourself behind. McKinnon spat. In the dust. You think one war-scarred drifter and a widow can hold a ranch? No, Jonah said. But we're not asking permission anymore. A long moment held. Then one of McKinnon's men shifted, uncertain. The other adjusted his reins. Jonah's rifle raised a breath, not a threat, just truth. It was enough. McKinnon sneered, fury blistering his face, but something in him cracked. He turned, jerking the reins hard, and rode off, pride bleeding behind him, no shots fired. But justice spoken in the oldest language, resolve. Afterward, the smoke curled into the sky like an old ghost rising. The fire at the edge of the field was beaten down by Jonah and Clara with shovels and soaked sacks. When it was done, the earth was black but breathing. By midday, neighbors came. First the Haglins from over the ridge. Then the old preacher, with his limp and Bible missing half its pages. A few hands from distant homesteads, drawn by the smoke and rumor. Some offered help, buckets, food, strong backs. Some only brought questions, but they stayed. And for the first time, Clara didn't feel like she was holding up the world alone. Jonah rebuilt the barn again. Not for her, not for himself, for the boy, the place where he'd taken his first breath. This time Jonah painted it red. The color of marrow, of strength, of blood that refuses to be forgotten. On a Tuesday, Jonah rode into town. He took nothing but a list Clara had scribbled and a locket she asked to be mended. He came back the next evening with flour, nails, fresh boots, and something unexpected, a rocking chair. He placed it beside Clara's, without a word. Just brushed the dust off the arms, sat down, and rocked slowly. The stars came thick and low that night. The air was warm, sweet with pine. Isaiah lay curled between them in a blanket of Clara's stitching. They rocked in silence for a while. "You came without a word," Clara said at last. Jonah turned. His voice was rough, quiet. "Didn't need one," he said. "You were calling." Clara didn't reply. Just reached across and touched his hand, the same way she had by the fire that long winter night. The wind stirred her shawl. The baby stirred and slept again, and the dust finally settled slow.